Hello, Joe. Thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited.
Let's first of all just start with the very bare bones of the APPG. Can you start by describing to us how you are campaigning for us ADHDers and what that looks like at Westminster?
Yes, I can give you a whole backstory on the APPG. So I think, firstly, just to start with what it means, it's an all-party parliamentary group, which is standard within Parliament. There's lots of them. You can have anything from beer, pubs, to some of the most serious of issues. The All-Party Parliamentary Group was set up initially by me. So I've been an MP before. I came back in 2024, but I was an MP in 2017 to 2019. And there was this huge void that there was no APPG for ADHD. So during my initial time in 2017, we set that up. And for the short 2 years I was there, we got quite far in the sense that we were able to have the conversation with the then government at that particular time. Then I had a 5-year sabbatical. And it was good. I was a trustee of the ADHD Foundation. So I was still working as secretariat to the APPG, but I just feel within that 5-year time, we didn't get any further, if you like. So I was look, it's been one of the drivers for me to get back into Parliament and blooming set this APPG up and start running with it again. So that's why I'm really passionate about chairing it, just to drive that forward. I think the wider bit is, why am I involved in ADHD? Why am I so passionate about it, and what drives me with regards to that? And that's a whole backstory which goes back many, many, many years. Do you want to hear that?
Yeah, we do.
That was going to be my next question. Go on. So what's your relationship to ADHD, and what's your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have asked my sister permission that I speak about this, because it's only right that I do at every opportunity. But I've got a younger sister who's 2 years younger than me. And we had quite, a sort of usual sort of education, good family background. There was no, very, from a working class background, but nothing that, that there was untoward. But my sister, even throughout primary school, there was just something so chaotic about her. And growing up, it was quite fun, apart from the fights that we used to get into. But there was, as she got older, risky behaviour started to take effect. There was drugs, there was obviously being off school. She got pregnant at 15. She'd had 2 children by the time she was 18. I'm not saying that's risky behaviour, but it was all part of an issue that, or a lifestyle that she took. And it was only when I was in my 20s, I started to hear about ADHD. It wasn't at all what we hear about now. And it was a bit of a sit down moment with her and said, look, I think this is what you've got. This explains everything. And can I just say, though, as well, because I've talked about her being this chaotic person, she did then absolutely settle down. She then she went to university and did an arts degree. She is so creative. She's an amazing, wonderful person. She just has this element of her life which basically just went out of control at times. And it was that realization then for her, and then for me, to think, oh, I think I've got it too. It explains so much. Me and my sister are very different, but as we know, ADHD affects people in very different ways. And then looking at my family as well, my mum, my dad, we're all on that spectrum. I used to think that we were normal as a family. This sounds awful. But then when I got married and then spent Christmases with my husband's family, and where you'd go and you'd drink sherry from a little cup, and then you'd come to dinner, and then you'd watch the Queen's speech at that particular time, and it was all really respectful. And then we'd go to my house after all of that, and it was just chaos. And then so that really hit home for me, that we were just all this chaotic family, which I love and I adore, what makes us. But it explains an awful lot. And I think then, look, going back to my childhood as well, and some of my peers that were in our friendship groups, some of them are no longer with us because things like addiction, criminality just envelope them. That's the route that they took. And then to look back and explain, why am I so lucky? What happened to them? They went to similar schools, they had similar backgrounds, good parents. What happened to them that put them on that path? And for me, neurodiversity, being neurodivergent, the addiction side of things explained an awful lot. And I think going into politics, I've always used that bit of an analogy. Why are some people so lucky and why do others, fall by the wayside?
Can I just say, it's so interesting what you say about the Queen's speech, because I had exactly the same revelation about that. About my family never, ever, ever, ever hit the 3:00 Queen's speech on Christmas Day for exactly the same reason as your family. And you think it's perfectly normal until you go around to someone else's for Christmas, don't you? And you realise it's calmer there.
It wasn't until I got married that I realised I had ADHD. It was my wife coming along going, actually, mate, this stuff isn't quite as straightforward as you think it is. Yeah, so that's...
Absolutely.
So you've established this APPG, this All-Party Parliamentary Group. So this is a group of people who meet from all parties, all represented, to come and talk about ADHD. What are the aims of the APPG? In your wildest dreams, what would you like to see?
I think just that, recognition, research. I mean, there's lots involved within them two words, if you like. But I think, if government recognise the impact that ADHD can have if not supported, then we will be able to put sufficient pathways into place.
Let's talk about some of those, Jo. What kinds of ways do you think as a society we are impacted by people who have ADHD?
I think, the first thing is the sort of stigma relating to it. We still get, and we still hear, unfortunately, that it's a made up thing. It's just naughty kids. Didn't happen in my day. I think there's lots that we've got to do with regards to proper recognition of what ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions are. Only then, will we be able to create the proper pathways that we need through all our life, if you like. So all our life stages. So yes, that's public services, but also employment, businesses, and everything that touches a person's pathway. So
when you talk about these different things, because what you are discussing here in ADHD affects so many different ministerial areas, doesn't it? I mean, prisons is one that springs to mind. Obviously, health, education, work. Are you finding that the ministers in charge of those briefs are responsive to the subjects that you raise? How is the government attending to us? Are they willing to listen, do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes. But that's been a journey. This isn't, it's not been a straightforward yes, if you like, because it is really difficult to get that platform. I think we're fortunate now that I'm more able now to get round the table and to speak to ministers in comparison. And I'm going to compare the time I was in before, but that's not to say that there weren't sympathetic government ministers the time I was in before. Robert Buckland springs to mind. He was the Justice Secretary, and he attended some of our APPGs, and he was so passionate about it. So sometimes it is of that learned behaviour and understanding themselves of ministers of what this means. And Robert Buckland had, some very direct experience with regards to that. So massively sympathetic to our cause. And he actually did some of the screenings in prisons. He started and kick-started some of that. But again, so I think for me now it's been easier. So the 2 years is now coming up to how long I've been in this Parliament to the 2 years that I was in before. We did get a commitment of Theresa May, actually. She was the then Prime Minister, and we asked her about counting ADHD. Because we were in an unknown. Some CCGs, as they were called at the time, they used to obviously count how many people were diagnosed, and she did give a commitment to that. So you can push and you can get somewhere. This Parliament, I think we had an event a few weeks ago, and we had Zabir, who's now the minister that is responsible for this particular issue, and he attended our event, and he gave a very, very strong commitment that he understands, he's listening, and he wants to be involved. For me, that's gold dust. That's good. Getting the time in the diary with the ministers is the difficult bit, but it is a huge step forward for them to publicly come out and say, this is, I'm here, I'm listening, is good.
And what's changing, do you think? I mean, do you think that they're starting to understand, the dangers to people of undiagnosed ADHD, but also the benefits to society of people receiving treatment and support? Do you think that message is getting through? Is that why we're seeing a change?
I think so. I think we've got to keep banging that drum. Without doubt, it's not a case of, we think they understand, we can sit back and we can relax. We have to keep going. That's with people who are affected, that are still blocked in a system, that are not getting the support at schools, that are failing within employment. These are the things that we need to continually push. The thing with Parliament, I think, is what I find frustrating, and no doubt this sort of goes to why people get frustrated, is that you've got all these big departments with civil servants that lie behind them. How you join up one particular issue that affects so many departments. So health is the obvious one, education, the justice system, as you said, it's you crack one and then it's on to the other. So I do think that then, for me, that's the next best big thing that we absolutely need to push. And it's frustrating for people like me. We've got an issue here. I do think that, again, I think it goes back to your other question as well, Sam, again, talking about education when we're looking at the Send White Paper. And the Minister, the Secretary of State, Bridget, has been very, very clear with me. I get invited to the roundtables, which I'm really grateful for because of this particular issue. And, she just said, Jo, this is the start. This white paper isn't, this is it. We're going to walk away and we're done. This is the start. We need to keep having the conversation at how we're making our schools inclusive for everybody, how we're supporting people with neurodivergent conditions. So it's a conversation to keep on. It doesn't stop.
And what about you mentioned the Education Secretary. What about the Health Secretary? Because it did, I've got to ask about Wes Streeting. He did seem to get himself in a bit of a muddle at the end of last year. He's begun a review into services for mental health, autism and ADHD. He seemed to be suggesting that there was a problem with overdiagnosis. He then seems to have rode back from that. I think from our point of view, we know that there was an NHS task force report from NHS England last year that was very clear that this is not overdiagnosed. So, do you think that the Health Secretary is clear on his position? And also, why have we got another report looking at potential overdiagnosis?
Yeah, so I think you're right to highlight this, Sam, and I think it was a frustration not just with yourself, but with me and others that have been talking about ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions. I think there is an undercurrent, and again, not just from what you've just said with regards to Wes, but politically, where there are other conditions where I think it goes back to that recognition of what these conditions are, is that they're made up. Again, do they exist? They're overdiagnosed because people have seen it on TikTok. And it's not just with neurodiverse diverse conditions as well. There's things like long COVID, ME, and that are put under that umbrella as well. There's a real fight that I think we've got to have politically about what these conditions are. And I think there's something about us all creating this alliance to say, look, these are very real conditions and we need support. I think you're right that there has been a roadmap with regards to this. And I think that's why I really wanted to highlight the commitment that we did get from Sabir, because that was a commitment from that department, the department to sort of say, look, we're here, we recognise this. He did allude to, comments being made, but I'm making this position clear now that I'm here and we're supporting it. And as a department, we'll go forward. I think the other thing to remember as well, because what sits behind the ministers are our civil servants. And I've had some really good meetings with some of them as well with regards to ADHD. Again, they've been working within this domain for longer than I have. The fact that they are very passionate about pushing this forward as well. So when you're seeing a little bit of a change from, ministers' take on this too as well, speaking to civil servants that sit behind that, for me, I feel a lot more positive than I did last year. I don't know if you saw my Westminster Hall debate, and I basically laid it out. This is not a condition that's overdiagnosed.
I saw that.
I think.
What are we saying about the review that's currently taking place that was then launched by Wes Streeting at the end of December? Because from the outside, it feels like the NHS task force has already done that work. So
I think what's happening is because of the blockages that we've got in the system. So I'll look to Greater Manchester and the Integrated Care Board. They are doing a huge review themselves because the system's broke, as we know, because there's so many people that are languishing on waiting lists. They're getting no support whatsoever. So there's it is frustrating when they tell me, look, we've paused. We're not going to, unless it's really serious, very complex needs, we're not going to basically put anyone into the system. I think that was until April. I think that's now going to be lifted. So that's, when you're thinking of these children that are at school that are getting failed because they're not getting support, it's heartbreaking. But I think for what they're wanting to do is to create these health hubs. So I think it's more a review in trying to get a picture of where the country is. Because this, I can look at Greater Manchester as just one aspect of this. We've got really good practice in other parts of the country where it's the waiting lists are not as bad, but where it's not working, I think we have to get that picture. And it goes back to my question back in blooming 2018 when I asked Theresa May, how are we counting this? How are we recording this? How do we know the extent of the problem if we don't know how many people have been diagnosed or are on waiting lists, or et cetera, et cetera? So it goes back to having that full picture to see what we actually need to do to put that support in.
Thank you for explaining that, and not to harp on the point, but just finally then. So are you confident that the Health Secretary himself does not think that ADHD is overdiagnosed, and that ultimately his department is supportive of helping people with ADHD?
I think I can absolutely say with confidence the last bit with the department. I think with more confidence, you can never be 100%. I think for me to have a direct one-to-one with Wes is when I can come back on here and say, I'm confident, let me, you know, and again, this is just part of my work, you know, as part, as being an MP, and getting, you know, that one-to-one to be able to basically put our flag in the sand, and see where Wes puts his.
And if we have someone listening to this who is not lucky enough to be a constituent of yours and is experiencing, you know, terrible delays in a diagnosis for themselves or for their kid right now, what can they do? Is it worth contacting their MP? Is it worth their MP getting on board and talking to you and politicising this and kind of, you know, upscaling it so that, you know, what can they do to be heard?
Katie, I'm so glad you asked that. I think honestly, the power that constituents have, you know, do not underestimate it. I mean, it's difficult for me. I'd love to help everybody within the country if they were struggling, but what I would advise is for them to contact their MP. They are, you know, at the end of the day, in 2029, whenever that election is called, they hold the power. And the power of an email to say, look, this is my issue. Please, you know, even if it's just, can you attend the APPG? You know, can you get in touch with the Secretariat? Or, you know, can you highlight that this is an issue in my area that feeds into some of the work that we're doing here, you know, within the APPG? That, you know, I would advise anybody to contact their MP if they're struggling with the system or if there's blockages within schools, even in the workplace. We don't talk enough about that. You know, absolutely contact your MP, let them know, because at the end of the day, if they're not going to do anything, their power lies within that vote. And if you're not going to help me, then, you know, that does cement a lot.
Yeah, and we you'd be amazed at how many messages we get from people saying, what can we do about X to do with ADHD? How can we change the world about Y? And it's about feeling powerless, isn't it? When you're experiencing that kind of, you know, lack of direction or not knowing where to turn or what to do. I was really compelled by what you said earlier about we as ADHDers in this community, we all need to be raising our voices, don't we?
Yeah,
and if the most direct way of doing that is getting our MP to do it on our behalf, then maybe that's the first port of call, maybe.
Absolutely, Katie. I think you're absolutely right. It's, you know, I do not underestimate the power that people actually do have when it comes to, you know, putting a cause forward. I think there's other things that we need as well, that we need to be better doing, you know, so how we're going to feed into, you know, this 10-year plan, if you like, you know, if we are creating health hubs, what needs to be in them to support people. You know, I was talking to a constituent who, her son, you know, he has autism, and she's just saying there's nothing for me to be able to support my child. You know, there's no group. He's not at school yet, but you know, there's no sort of activity that supports me as a family. And I'm like, set something up. You know, you've got that power to be able to do that. I'll absolutely support you doing it. You know, so these are the conversations that we need to be having. So, and I'm sure, you know, MPs, whatever part of the country that they're in, whatever party they're in, you know, they're the things. It's the signposting, it's the supporting, you know, of what goes on in their community as well. There's a lot of power in that. But yeah, I think that I just advise, contact your MP.
We should be clear, people who perhaps don't follow this as detailed as we do. The NHS Task Force suggested that one of the ways to sort of deal with the backlog of people needing treatment was to look at, you know, local services being able to offer support to people before diagnosis. Are you clear that, Joe, that you think that is going forward the sort of key recommendation, that actually, you know, this whole model of piling people up for diagnosis and then waiting for medication needs to change, and we can start supporting people where they are? Is that what you see as the long-term solution?
I do, absolutely. I think, you know, again, it sort of goes back into the sort of schools inclusion model, and I've been quite forceful with regards to this. You know, I use the drop pavement analogy, if you like, so that they were designed for wheelchair users. But guess what? Mums with buggies use them. People with shopping trolleys use them. Even cyclists use them to get back on a curb easier. That's what your classroom should be. It should be inclusive for everybody so that nobody's singled out, but respectful to the way and the different way that everybody learns, or everybody adapts to classrooms. And so there is something about that the support should be there without having to have a diagnosis or a piece of paper as it is now. Because guess what? I speak to so many parents and they say, well, I've got this piece of paper. Now what? Nothing changes.
And also it brings us back to that whole spectrum thing as well, isn't it? Some kids don't qualify, some adults don't qualify for a diagnosis. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't benefit from small changes in their working or school lives. Absolutely. That would make life easier for them. Exactly. So if something makes life easier for you, then it's worth it. Do
you think also, Jo, that's an easier argument to make? Because in a way, we're sort of saying, look, what we need to do is just offer sort of holistic support in schools and for people in the communities, rather than going, here's this one group of people who've got ADHD and we need then to spend billions of pounds on diagnosis and medication. Is it easier to sort of say, actually, this is something that everybody benefits from?
I think, there's a way. I mean, obviously, I only caught the end of that. You broke up a little bit, Sam, but I think just on the basis that it's easier to say that rather than spending so much money. I think we all know and understand that there's not a lot of money out there. So I think just getting it right at that, at that preventative stage, if you like, so that the support is there. So, if there are backlogs that people are not being supported, I think there's, we've got to do that model anyway. I think that's a given. And then guess what? In times where we have got money to spend on these, this is where we can build it up. But I think that, get the support in at whatever level. And then if there are times that we can spend money on what we actually do need to do, I think this is the thing. I think it goes back to, like even the white paper for the SEN, yes, we need more specialist schools for really complex cases, because I know there's talk about, everybody should have this mainstream education. Not everybody is going to be suited to mainstream education. And, we can't pretend that there are some,
it doesn't benefit everybody. It doesn't benefit everybody.
But at this moment in time, there's not the money to spend on the specialist schools. So still make that classroom inclusive. And then further down that line, when things get better,
in a more perfect world,
I think that's what we absolutely need to push for. So I think for now, that foundation of support is the nurturing bit that we need to deliver. We really do. It's desperate, the preventative side, so that we're not failing children before their lives have started, is what we need to look at.
So to wrap up, Jo, I mean, Sam and I have definitely sort of sensed a change in the conversation over the 3 years we've been making this podcast, that we've definitely turned a corner in the coverage that we see in the broadsheets of ADHD, for instance. Not always, but definitely there's been a bit of a sea change. The very fact that you are chairing an APPG on ADHD suggests to me that there has been a sea change at Westminster. But do you remain optimistic about the future for the ADHD community?
I'm glass half full, Katie. I have got to be. I really have. Flipping heck. If I wasn't, that'd be it. I wouldn't have come back. I am glass half full. I think just the nature of this place down here, the cogs run slow. I wish everything could be faster and more aligned when we're talking about cross-department work that we need to do. But I am confident that people do acknowledge it and take it seriously. I think, again, the more pressure that people with ADHD, who people are blocked in the system, that they put onto their representatives, I think the better. You know, there's some work that we maybe have to, you know, do with the local government association, you know, in making, you know, how we are being neuro friendly in places, in, you know, from a local perspective. So when you're talking about, you know, local provision. So I think these are the conversations that we just need to keep pushing. It doesn't stop, but I am optimistic, Katie. I am. I've got to be.
I'm really glad to hear it, because so are we. And thank you for doing what you're doing for all of us.
It's a pleasure. It really is.
Jo Platt, MP and advocate for the ADHD community. Thank you so much for joining us on You're Wrong About ADHD.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
both
Jo.
so much. Thanks.